What if the most dangerous question you could ever ask isn't, did you commit a crime, but simply, how do you know that's true? A priest stood up in a packed debate hall, microphone in hand, absolute certainty carved into his face. He pointed across the room and said, "Science cannot explain the origin of morality. Only God can." The room hummed with approval. Heads nodded. And then came the response, not angry, not theatrical, but devastatingly calm. I don't think that's even a well-formed question yet. That sentence alone should have made everyone's spine tighten. Because here is what most people never realize. The deadliest weapon in any intellectual debate is not a louder voice or a bigger vocabulary. It is the ability to question the question itself. The priest had assumed the battlefield. He had assumed morality needed an external author. He had assumed only God can was a complete sentence. It was not. It was a starting assumption dressed as a conclusion. And the moment someone had the courage and the clarity to say, "Wait, let's examine your premise first," the entire argument began to unravel like wet paper. That is not arrogance. That is intellectual honesty. That is what real thinking looks like in real time, under real pressure, in front of a real crowd. What if everything you were taught to believe was never actually explained to you, only handed to you, wrapped in authority and tradition, and you accepted it because questioning it felt dangerous? This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about how most human beings form their beliefs. We don't arrive at them through investigation. We inherit them through repetition. A child is told, "God made the world," before they can even ask, "What came before the world?" By the time they're old enough to question it, the belief has already calcified into identity. To challenge it feels like a personal attack, not an intellectual exercise. Now imagine a physicist, someone professionally allergic to unexamined assumptions, sitting across from that worldview in a formal debate. The priest leans on tradition. The physicist leans on evidence. The priest says, "Faith doesn't need proof." The physicist responds, "Then how do you know your faith points in the right direction and not towards something false?" Silence. Because that question exposes the fundamental crack in every unfalsifiable belief system. If nothing can disprove it, then nothing truly proves it either. A belief that cannot be wrong about anything is actually a belief that says nothing meaningful at all. That is not philosophy. That is physics applied to thought. What if the universe doesn't actually need a designer? And the reason that feels so deeply unsettling is not because it's wrong, but because you were never given the emotional tools to sit comfortably with genuine uncertainty. One of the most powerful moves the priest made that day was appealing to complexity. He gestured at the cosmos, the staggering precision of physical constants, the fine-tuned dance of gravity and electromagnetism, and declared, "All of this cannot be an accident. Someone had to set the dials." It sounds reasonable. It feels reasonable. It is the intuitive cry of the human brain confronted with overwhelming design. But here is the trap. Complexity is not evidence of intention. A snowflake is extraordinarily complex. A tornado has breathtaking structure. The double helix of DNA is almost incomprehensible in its elegance. And yet we have natural, testable, repeatable explanations for all of them. The priest was making what logicians call the argument from personal incredulity. I cannot imagine how this happened without a creator, therefore a creator exists. But the universe has never once consulted your imagination before deciding how to behave. Your inability to picture a godless cosmos is a fact about your brain, not a fact about reality. And mistaking one for the other is where the argument silently collapses. What if God, not as a spiritual feeling, but as a scientific explanation, is actually the laziest answer ever invented? Not the most profound, not the most comforting, the laziest. Because God did it, terminates inquiry. It doesn't explain, it stops explanation. When the priest declared that the origin of the universe required a divine cause, what he was really saying was, I have arrived at the edge of my current understanding, and I am going to park a supernatural being there and stop digging. But here is what the history of science shows us, over and over and over again. Every time we parked God at the edge of our knowledge, we eventually dug deeper and found something more extraordinary than the God we had placed there. Lightning was God's anger, then it was electricity. Disease was divine punishment, then it was microbiology. The sun moved around the earth because God arranged it so, then we looked through telescopes. Each time the frontier of ignorance receded, the space for divine intervention shrank. This is not atheism. This is pattern recognition. This is what happens when you refuse to let comfort masquerade as curiosity. Saying, I don't know yet, is not weakness. It is the engine of every discovery humanity has ever made. God did it is not an answer. It is a full stop placed exactly where a question mark belongs. What if the reason the priest's argument felt so powerful to the audience wasn't because it was logically strong, but because it was emotionally strong? Because it activated something ancient and tribal and deeply human in the room. This is the dirty secret of almost every debate about God that has ever happened in public. It is not really a debate about evidence. It is a debate about identity. When the priest spoke, half the room didn't evaluate his argument. They felt their belonging confirmed, their community validated, their childhood protected, their fear of death temporarily soothed. And when the physicist pushed back, those same people didn't hear a logical rebuttal. They heard a threat. Now understand, this is not a criticism of religious people. This is a description of human neurology. We are pattern-seeking, tribe-protecting, meaning-craving creatures. Our brains did not evolve to find truth. They evolved to survive. And in that survival architecture, a coherent story held by your community will always feel more true than an uncomfortable fact held by a stranger. The genius of the physicist's response was that he didn't attack the feeling. He didn't mock the priest. He didn't perform superiority. He simply refused to let emotion substitute for evidence, quietly, patiently, relentlessly, until the logical structure beneath the priest's argument had nowhere left to hide. What if the most honest thing a brilliant mind can say, the thing that actually takes more courage than any declaration of faith, is simply, I don't know, and I'm okay with that? The priest had certainty, absolute, polished, rehearsed certainty. And in a debate hall, certainty looks like confidence. Certainty sounds like authority. Certainty makes audiences feel safe. But certainty about the unknowable is not a virtue. It is a performance. Because nobody, not a priest, not a pope, not the most decorated theologian in human history, actually knows what caused the universe to exist. Nobody has stood outside of time and space and watched it begin. Nobody has held consciousness in their hands and measured its source. And the person who claims total knowledge of total mystery is not enlightened. They are simply unwilling to feel confused. Contrast that with the physicist who said, I find the question of how the universe began to be one of the most beautiful and terrifying open questions in existence, and I would rather spend my entire life honestly uncertain than spend one comfortable second falsely sure. That sentence doesn't close the room, it opens it. It doesn't end the conversation, it deepens it. Because real intellectual courage isn't declaring you have the answer. It's having the nerve to live inside the question, permanently, proudly, without flinching. A priest walked into a debate hall with God in his corner. He was confident, he was prepared, he had centuries of theology behind him, the weight of tradition in his voice, and an audience that was largely already on his side. He stepped to the microphone and delivered what he believed to be the decisive blow. Science, he said, cannot explain the origin of morality. Without God, there is no foundation for right and wrong. Without God, the universe has no author. Without God, your life has no meaning. He sat down. The room applauded. Then the other side stood up. No anger, no theatre, just a calm, almost curious voice that said, "I think before we can answer your question, we need to ask whether your question is actually well-formed." The room went very quiet. The priest's first move was to point at morality and declare it requires a divine source. This is an ancient argument, dressed in modern clothes, and it sounds profound until you pull at one thread. If God is the source of morality, then morality is moral because God said so. Which means if God commanded cruelty, cruelty would be moral. The priest would never accept that conclusion, which means he already believes morality exists independently of God's commands, which means his argument defeats itself before the other side even speaks. The physicist didn't need to attack religion. He simply needed to hold a mirror up to the argument's internal logic and wait. Then came the complexity argument. The priest swept his arm across the cosmos, the staggering precision of the physical constants, the fine-tuned architecture of existence, and said, someone must have set the dials. Someone must have intended all this. And again, the room nodded, because it feels true. When you look at a galaxy, when you stare into the mathematics of quantum mechanics, when you contemplate the sheer improbability of conscious life emerging from blind physics, your brain screams design. Your brain screams purpose. Your brain screams, someone must have done this. But your brain is not a reliable narrator. Your brain evolved to detect patterns because pattern detection kept your ancestors alive. A rustle in the grass meant a predator. A darkening sky meant a storm. Pattern recognition was survival. So your brain applies it everywhere, including to the universe itself. You see order and you automatically infer intent. Not because intent is there, but because your brain is running ancient survival software in a context it was never designed for. The physicist said it quietly but precisely. The fact that the universe appears designed to you is a fact about your evolved cognitive architecture. It is not a fact about the universe. The priest shifted. He moved to his strongest ground, the emotional ground. He said that science gives us facts, but cannot give us meaning. That the cold equations of physics cannot explain why a mother loves her child, why a man sacrifices himself for a stranger, why human beings reach for transcendence in every culture across all of recorded history. And here was the most genuinely interesting moment of the debate, because the physicist did not disagree. He said, "You're right that meaning is not a fact you can measure with an instrument, but the absence of a measurable source does not automatically produce a supernatural one. The history of science is the history of things we once attributed to God, thunder, plague, the movement of stars, that turned out to have natural explanations more astonishing than the divine ones we invented. I'm not certain there is no God. I am certain that I cannot explain this is not evidence that God explains it." Certainty without evidence is not faith. It is fiction you have decided not to examine. The priest had entered that room holding certainty like a shield. The physicist had entered it holding questions like a lantern. And in a dark room, the lantern always beats the shield. Because the shield hides you, but the lantern shows you where to walk. What the physicist understood deeply, structurally, in the bones of how he thought, was that intellectual honesty requires you to be just as rigorous about what you want to be true as about what you fear might be true. The priest wanted God to exist. That want had quietly colonized his logic, shaped his premises, pre-selected his conclusions. He wasn't reasoning toward the truth. He was reasoning to defend a position he had already decided to hold. And the physicist? He wanted the universe to be understandable. He wanted evidence to matter. He wanted the question itself, this enormous, ancient, trembling question of why is there something rather than nothing, to remain open. Not because he was lazy, not because he lacked conviction, but because he understood that a closed question stops producing knowledge. And an open question, honestly held, is the engine of everything humanity has ever learned. The priest challenged science to explain God. The physicist responded by explaining why that challenge had the wrong shape. Not because God is impossible, but because God, as an explanation, explains nothing. It does not tell you which God. It does not tell you what God wants. It does not generate predictions you can test or falsify. It simply moves the mystery one step backward. Who made God? And then asks you to accept that that question, uniquely, does not need an answer. Why does the universe need a creator, but the creator does not? Why is God always existed acceptable, but the universe always existed in some form is not? These are not gotcha questions. They are the same question applied consistently, and consistency, applying the same standard of evidence to every claim, including the ones you love, is not disrespect. It is the minimum requirement for taking an idea seriously. The room did not erupt in applause at the end of the physicist's response. It did something more interesting. It went quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that happens when a large group of people are suddenly, uncomfortably, privately thinking. That is the real victory. Not humiliating the priest, not dismantling religion, not winning a popularity contest. The real victory was cracking open the shell of unexamined assumption in enough minds that the question got bigger and louder and more honest. The priest came to that debate to deliver answers. The physicist came to reveal that the answers we carry often depend on questions we have never dared examine. One of them left the room having comforted the crowd. The other left having disturbed it. And in the long arc of human understanding, the ones who disturb us, gently, precisely, without cruelty, are almost always the ones who move us forward. The priest was not the villain of this story. He was a human being doing what human beings do, reaching for certainty in an uncertain world, building meaning in the face of mystery, protecting the frameworks that hold a community together. That impulse is not stupid. It is ancient and it is real. But the moment that impulse is allowed to hide from scrutiny, to declare itself exempt from the same standards we apply to every other claim, it stops being faith and starts being a wall. What happened in that debate hall was not a battle between religion and science. It was a collision between two different relationships with the unknown. One relationship says, I have the answer. The other says, I have the question. One relationship closes, the other opens. And when you are standing on the frontier of human understanding, looking out at the vast dark of everything we have not yet discovered, the only honest posture, the only brave posture, is to keep your eyes open, keep your assumptions loose, and keep asking. Not because the answers don't matter, but because the quality of your question determines the quality of your answer. And the most extraordinary answers in all of human history came from people who refused to accept the first answer they were given.